The late March air, crisp and tinged with the nascent scent of spring, did little to soothe the knot tightening in Janelle's stomach. Ridgeview Middle School loomed before her, a brick and glass behemoth radiating the low hum of adolescent energy. She hugged her textbooks closer, a flimsy shield against the invisible currents of scrutiny she felt emanating from the clusters of students milling about. Invisibility, that was her strategy. Blend in, fade into the background, become a neutral shade in the vibrant tapestry of middle school life. It was a survival tactic honed over years of navigating new schools, new faces, the perpetual outsider looking in. She slipped through the heavy front doors, the sudden shift from bright sunlight to the dim, echoing hallway amplifying the echo in her chest. Room 203. She located it on the creased map clutched in her hand, each fold a testament to the nervous energy she'd expended memorizing its location. The classroom door was ajar, revealing a cacophony of chatter and laughter. Taking a deep breath, she pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest, drawing a scattering of curious glances. Most quickly returned to their conversations, but the weight of those fleeting observations settled on her shoulders like a physical burden. Scanning the room, she located an empty seat near the back, a strategic position minimizing potential interaction. The worn wooden desk felt cool beneath her fingertips, a small comfort in the overwhelming newness of it all. She placed her bag on the floor, slid into the seat, and opened her notebook, the familiar ritual grounding her. The rhythmic scratching of her pen against the paper was a small act of defiance against the churning anxiety within. A shadow fell across her desk. She looked up, her gaze colliding with a pair of cold, assessing eyes. He was tall, even for an 8th grader, with a swagger that radiated an aura of unearned authority. The faint scent of expensive cologne mingled with the underlying tang of sweat. He leaned in, his proximity invading her carefully constructed bubble of personal space. "You in my seat." His voice, though quiet, held a sharp edge, a subtle threat woven into the seemingly innocuous question. Janelle's mind raced. His seat? The concept felt absurd, a territorial claim on a shared space. But the intensity in his eyes, the subtle flexing of his jaw, warned her against arguing the logic. Her instinct was to shrink, to apologize, to make herself as small as possible. But a flicker of defiance, a spark of unfamiliar resistance, ignited within her. "Pick any seat," a voice called from the front of the room. Mr. Drummond, the homeroom teacher, his attention finally drawn to the unfolding situation. He gestured vaguely around the room, his tone suggesting a mild annoyance at the interruption. "Yeah, but I sit there every day," the boy insisted, his gaze fixed on Janelle, a challenge in the unwavering intensity of his stare. She could feel the weight of the other students' gazes, silent spectators to this unspoken power play. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She could feel the blood rushing to her cheeks, the heat of betrayal of her carefully constructed composure. "Say something," a voice urged within her. "Don't let him win." But her voice seemed to have caught in her throat, a prisoner of her own fear. The silence stretched, taut and heavy with unspoken tension. The boy shifted his weight, his impatience radiating outwards. He looked at Mr. Drummond, then back at Janelle. A smirk twisted his lips. "Look," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. But before he could utter another word, the bell rang, shattering the tense tableau. The classroom erupted in a flurry of movement, the other students seizing the opportunity to escape the suffocating atmosphere. Janelle remained rooted to her spot, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Relief warred with a simmering anger, the unexpected spark of defiance refusing to be extinguished. She gathered her books, her hands trembling slightly, and made her way to the front of the room, passing the boy, who stood by the door, a smug expression on his face. She met his gaze, her own expression carefully neutral, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken battle lines drawn between them. Outside in the hallway, The chaos of the passing period swirled around her. She felt a hand on her arm, a light touch that made her jump. "That was intense," a voice said. She turned to see a girl with bright, inquisitive eyes and a warm smile. "I'm Zadie," she continued. "Zadie Moreno. You knew, right?" Janelle nodded, surprised by the unexpected friendliness. "I'm Janelle," she managed, her voice still slightly shaky. "Don't let Brixton get to you," Zadie said, her tone casual but laced with a knowingness that surprised Janelle. "He's like that with everyone. Thinks he owns the place." The name Brixton resonated with Janelle, a label attached to the face of her unease. "He's been doing that for years," a quiet voice piped up. A boy with shy eyes and a hesitant smile stood beside Zadie. "I'm Kylan," he offered, his voice barely above a whisper. "He took my lunch money last week." The casual revelation hung in the air, a stark reminder of the hidden currents of power and intimidation that flowed beneath the seemingly placid surface of school life. Janelle looked at Kylan, her heart aching with a sudden empathy. She saw a reflection of her own past anxieties, her own struggles to navigate the treacherous waters of social hierarchy. In that moment, something shifted within her. The fear began to recede, replaced by a quiet resolve. This was not just about a seat. It was about something more. It was about finding her voice, not just for herself, but for those who had been silenced for too long. The fluorescent lights of room 203 hummed a monotonous tune, a soundtrack to Janelle's escalating anxiety. Dust motes danced in the sterile, artificial glow, a chaotic ballet against the rigid rows of desks. The air, thick with the scent of freshly waxed linoleum and teenage nervous energy, pressed against her like a physical weight. She clutched her backpack straps, the worn nylon a familiar comfort in the sea of unfamiliar faces. She'd chosen the seat strategically second row, by the window, hoping its proximity to the outside world might offer some semblance of escape. It was a naive hope, she realized, as the classroom door swung open and Brixton Hale sauntered in. He moved with an almost predatory grace, a swagger that drew the room's attention like moths to a flame. His laughter echoed, loud and boisterous, followed by the hushed whispers and nervous giggles of those in his orbit. Janelle watched, her stomach tightening, as he made his way towards her desk. His eyes, dark and sharp like shards of obsidian, met hers, and a flicker of something cold and calculating passed through them. "Move." The command was clipped, devoid of any pretense of politeness. Janelle's breath hitched in her throat. The room seemed to hold its breath, every eye fixed on the silent tableau unfolding between them. Just ignore him, she told herself, he'll go away. She kept her gaze fixed on the open textbook before her, the words blurring into meaningless ink stains on the page. Brixton's shadow fell across her desk. She could feel the heat radiating off him, an oppressive presence that seemed to suffocate the air around her. The scent of his cologne, something sharp and musky, invaded her senses, another layer of unwelcome intrusion. He reached down, his fingers closing around the back of her chair. The casual, almost lazy, way he did it was more menacing than any outright threat. He tugged, and the chair screeched against the linoleum floor, the sound jarring in the sudden silence. Janelle's knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of the desk. "Don't react," a voice whispered in her mind. "Don't give him the satisfaction." But a tremor of anger, hot and unexpected, began to simmer beneath her carefully constructed composure. This was her seat. She had chosen it, and she wasn't going to let him take it from her. He tugged again, harder this time. The chair scraped against the floor, pulling her with it. She felt a surge of defiance, a refusal to be moved, to be intimidated. Her fingers tightened around the desk, her body resisting the pull. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Mr. Drummond, oblivious, continued writing on the board, his back to the escalating confrontation. "I said move." Brixton's voice was laced with impatience, a growl rumbling in his chest. He pulled again, his grip tightening on the chair. "Take your hand off me." The words were quiet, almost a murmur, yet they carried a weight that stunned the room into silence. Even Brixton seemed momentarily taken aback. He hesitated, his hand still gripping the chair, his eyes searching hers as if trying to decipher some hidden code. Janelle met his gaze, her own eyes steady and unwavering. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a rising tide of indignation. She wouldn't be bullied. Not by him. Not by anyone. A slow, almost imperceptible smile played at the corners of her lips. Does acting like this usually work for you? The question, delivered with such quiet composure, hung in the air like a challenge. Brixton's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. He released the chair, his hand clenching into a fist. The silence stretched, taut and brittle, as the two of them locked in a silent battle of wills. The air crackled with unspoken tension, the room a powder keg waiting for a spark. Janelle's heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the suffocating silence. She could feel the weight of the room's attention, a mixture of fear, anticipation, and something else, a nascent flicker of admiration. Brixton took a step back, his face flushed with anger. The sudden retreat seemed to deflate him. The aura of invincibility that usually cloaked him momentarily shattered. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, searching for words that wouldn't betray his momentary loss of control. Mr. Drummond, finally noticing the disruption, turned from the board. "Everything all right back there?" he asked, his voice tinged with mild annoyance. Before Brixton could respond, a voice piped up from the back of the room. Brixton tried to make Janelle move from her seat. "Mr. Drummond." It was Zadie Moreno, her voice clear and unwavering. Other voices chimed in, a chorus of whispers and murmurs filling the room. "He pulled her chair," someone said. "He was being mean," another added. Mr. Drummond frowned, his gaze shifting from Brixton to Janelle and back again. "Brixton," he said, his voice taking on a sterner tone, "is this true?" Brixton glared at Janelle, his eyes blazing with anger. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He looked from Mr. Drummond to the faces of his classmates, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. For the first time, perhaps, he was experiencing the consequences of his actions, the realization that his usual tactics of intimidation weren't working. And in the silence that followed, a new voice, small and hesitant, emerged from the corner of the room. "He does this all the time," Kylan Rivers whispered, his voice barely audible. "He took my lunch money last week." The fluorescent lights of room 203 hummed a monotonous tune, a soundtrack to Janelle's escalating anxiety. Dust motes danced in the artificial glow, each one a tiny, frantic reflection of the turmoil brewing within her. The scent of old textbooks and stale air hung heavy, a suffocating blanket that amplified the tightness in her chest. She gripped the edges of her notebook, the rough paper a small comfort in a sea of unfamiliar faces. Brixton's shadow loomed over her, a physical manifestation of the pressure building in the room. He hadn't moved, his posture radiating an almost predatory stillness. Janelle could feel the weight of his gaze, a palpable force that seemed to pin her to the chair. "Just breathe," she told herself, the words a silent mantra against the rising tide of panic. "Don't engage. Don't react." But her heart hammered against her ribs, a trapped bird desperate for escape. Each tick of the clock on the wall felt like a countdown to some unknown, terrifying consequence. He was waiting for something. A flinch, a tear, any sign of weakness he could exploit. "Look," Brixton said, his voice a low growl that resonated through the uneasy silence of the classroom. He leaned in closer, the scent of his cologne, something sharp and artificial, invading her personal space. "I don't like repeating myself." His words hung in the air, thick with unspoken threat. Janelle's stomach twisted. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that this wasn't just about a seat. It was about power, about establishing dominance. And she, in her quiet newness, had become his unwilling target. The whispers around them grew louder, a chorus of nervous anticipation. Janelle could feel their eyes on her, curious, apprehensive, perhaps even pitying. She hated it. The unwanted attention, the feeling of being exposed under a microscope. All she wanted was to disappear, to melt into the background and become invisible. But Brixton's presence, his aggressive posture, made that impossible. She was trapped in the spotlight, a reluctant actor in a play she didn't understand. "What's going on?" Mr. Drummond's voice, slightly amplified by the room's acoustics, cut through the tension like a rusty knife. He stood by the whiteboard, his expression a mixture of mild annoyance and confusion. He hadn't noticed the escalating confrontation until the collective murmur of the class had reached a critical mass. Janelle risked a glance at Brixton. His jaw tightened, the muscles in his neck flexing. For a fleeting moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his features. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a mask of indignant defiance. "She took my seat," Brixton said, his voice laced with a practiced innocence that Janelle found both infuriating and strangely pathetic. He gestured towards the chair, as if it were a throne unjustly usurped. He was playing to the audience, Janelle realized, crafting a narrative that painted him as the victim. And judging by the hesitant glances directed at her, some were buying it. Mr. Drummond frowned, his gaze shifting between Brixton and Janelle. He seemed momentarily bewildered, caught off guard by the unexpected conflict. "There are no assigned seats in this class, Brixton," he said, his voice regaining a measure of authority. He adjusted his glasses, a nervous tick Janelle noticed, and peered at Brixton over the rims. "Go to the office." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. The classroom erupted in a fresh wave of whispers. Brixton's face flushed crimson. For a long moment, he didn't move, his body rigid with disbelief. He had expected a different outcome, a reprimand for Janelle, a reinforcement of his established hierarchy. But Mr. Drummond, in his clumsy, somewhat belated intervention, had disrupted the script. The power dynamic had shifted. Janelle watched, a strange calm settling over her as Brixton finally turned and stalked towards the door, his shoulders slumped, the swagger gone. He paused at the threshold, casting a venomous glare back at her, a silent promise of retribution. Then he was gone, leaving a vacuum in the room that was quickly filled by a buzzing cacophony of whispers. Mr. Drummond cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the class. "All right, everyone, settle down," he said, his voice strained. But the whispers persisted, fueled by the unexpected drama. Janelle could feel their eyes on her, no longer apprehensive, but now filled with a strange mixture of curiosity and respect. The thought felt alien, unsettling. She hadn't sought this attention, this strange form of validation. She had simply wanted to be left alone. Zadie Moreno, the girl who had offered her a smile earlier, leaned across the aisle. "You okay?" she whispered, her voice soft and genuine. Janelle nodded, unable to articulate the complex emotions swirling within her. Relief, certainly, but also a lingering unease, a premonition that this was only the beginning. From the back of the room, a pair of shy eyes met hers. Kylan Rivers, a boy Janelle recognized as another frequent target of Brixton's taunts, offered a small, hesitant smile. It was a silent acknowledgement, a shared understanding of the subtle tyranny that had just been disrupted. In that moment, Janelle realized she wasn't alone. Her quiet act of defiance had resonated with others, had given them a flicker of hope in the face of their own silent struggles. And that, she thought, was a feeling worth more than invisibility. It was a feeling of quiet strength, of shared resilience. A feeling that, despite the lingering anxiety and the inevitable repercussions, she had done the right thing. The bell's shrill cry sliced through the tense atmosphere, releasing a flood of students into the hallway. Janelle felt the pressure of bodies surging around her, the cacophony of voices a dizzying wave. Her backpack, suddenly heavy on her shoulders, felt like a physical manifestation of the weight in her chest. She kept her head down, eyes fixed on the worn linoleum tiles, each scuff and scratch a miniature reflection of the turmoil within her. Just get to class. Just disappear. The thought echoed in the hollow space of her mind. She hadn't anticipated the aftermath, the ripple effect of her quiet defiance. The whispers followed her like shadows, clinging to the edges of her awareness. Did you see her face when he grabbed her? She didn't even blink. The words, sharp and laced with a mixture of awe and disbelief, pricked at Janelle's ears. She recognized the voice, a girl from her history class, the one with the intricate braids and the knowing eyes. Janelle wanted to melt into the wall, to become invisible, to erase the last hour from existence. Why me? The question clawed at her throat, a silent scream trapped within the cage of her ribs. She had wanted to be unnoticed, a ghost drifting through the halls of Ridge View Middle School. Instead, she had become the epicenter of a storm she hadn't intended to create. A low hum of conversation vibrated around her, punctuated by bursts of nervous laughter. She could feel the stares, the weight of unseen eyes dissecting her every move. The air crackled with an unfamiliar energy, a mixture of fear and excitement. Janelle hugged her books tighter, her knuckles bone-white against the worn covers. This wasn't the anonymity she had craved. This was a spotlight, harsh and unforgiving, exposing her to a scrutiny she wasn't prepared for. I should have just moved. The regret gnawed at her, a bitter taste in the back of her throat. But a flicker of something else ignited within her, a spark of defiance refusing to be extinguished. She hadn't started this, but she wouldn't back down. I'm Zadie Moreno, a voice said, cutting through the swirling currents of whispers. Janelle flinched, her gaze snapping up to meet the speaker's. Zadie stood before her, a small smile playing on her lips. Her eyes, a warm, inviting brown, held a spark of something Janelle couldn't quite decipher. Admiration? Solidarity? It was a look that warmed Janelle from the inside out, a beacon of connection in the isolating sea of faces. That was wild what happened back there, Zadie continued, her voice low and conspiratorial. Brixton Hill has never been challenged like that before. Janelle swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. The name, Brixton Hale, hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken implications. He was a force, a presence that seemed to permeate every corner of school. And she, Janelle Carter, the new girl, the quiet one, had dared to stand her ground. Janelle's mind raced, replaying the scene in agonizing detail. The way Brixton's eyes had narrowed, the curl of his lip, the possessive grip on the back of the chair. The fear had been a living thing, coiling in her stomach, tightening its icy grip around her lungs. But beneath the fear, something else had stirred, a quiet resolve, a refusal to be intimidated. She hadn't planned it, hadn't even consciously thought about it. It was a pure, instinctive reaction, a primal defense against the encroaching darkness. He just assumed, Janelle stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The words felt inadequate, failing to capture the complex mix of emotions that had flooded her. She felt a strange disconnect, as if she were watching the scene unfold from a distance, a spectator in her own life. Zadie nodded, her expression softening with understanding. He assumes a lot of things, she said, a hint of steel creeping into her voice. He's been getting away with it for too long. The words hung in the air, charged with unspoken meaning. Janelle sensed a history, a backstory she wasn't privy to, a web of intricate relationships and power dynamics that she was only beginning to glimpse. He's popular, Janelle managed, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. She had always been on the periphery, observing the intricate dance of social hierarchy from a safe distance. Popularity, with its dazzling allure and unspoken rules, had always seemed like a distant, unattainable realm. Zadie's smile turned wry. Popular is one word for it, she said, her tone laced with a subtle irony that didn't escape Janelle's notice. He's influential. People are afraid of him. Fear. The word resonated with Janelle, echoing the tremor that still lingered in her bones. It was a palpable thing, a thick, suffocating blanket that seemed to smother the very air she breathed. Janelle started, but the words trailed off, lost in the labyrinth of her own thoughts. She hadn't intended to become a symbol of resistance, a catalyst for change. She had simply wanted to sit in a chair. Zadie reached out, her hand lightly brushing Janelle's arm. The touch, small and unexpected, sent a jolt of warmth through Janelle's veins. "Don't worry," Zadie said, her voice gentle but firm. "You did the right thing." The words, simple yet profound, resonated deep within Janelle's soul. It was the validation she hadn't realized she craved, a lifeline in the turbulent sea of uncertainty. For the first time since stepping foot in Ridgeview Middle School, Janelle felt a flicker of hope, a fragile ember glowing in the darkness. Perhaps, just perhaps, she wouldn't have to navigate this new world alone. The antiseptic scent of the counselor's office clung to the air, a stark contrast to the lingering aroma of pizza from the cafeteria Janelle had just left. Fourth period was ticking by, each click of the wall clock a tiny hammer blow against a fragile quiet. Mrs. Haskins, a woman whose smile didn't quite reach her watchful eyes, sat opposite Janelle. Her office was a carefully constructed haven of beige and muted blues, designed, Janelle supposed, to soothe troubled minds. But Janelle wasn't troubled, not exactly. More displaced. Like a pebble skipped across the surface of a pond, she hadn't yet sunk into the depths of this new place, this new life. "I wanted to check on you, Janelle," Mrs. Haskins began, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "What Brixton did was wrong." Janelle nodded, tracing the outline of a faded flower on the worn armchair. "Wrong." The word felt too small, too neat to encompass the messy jumble of emotions swirling within her. Surprise, certainly. Irritation, definitely. Fear? Oddly, no. Not even a flicker. It was this absence of fear that both puzzled and unsettled her. Had she become so accustomed to being overlooked, to existing on the periphery, that even a blatant act of aggression felt insignificant? "He shouldn't have touched your things," Mrs. Haskins continued, her gaze steady, searching. And his language, well, it was unacceptable. Janelle's fingers tightened around the fabric of the chair. She could still feel the phantom weight of Brixton's hand on her backpack, hear the echo of his sneering voice. It wasn't the physicality of it that bothered her. It was the presumption, the casual disregard for her presence, for her right to simply exist in the same space. "Are you all right?" Mrs. Haskins' voice softened further, laced with a gentle concern that grated against Janelle's carefully constructed wall of indifference. She didn't want concern. She wanted to be invisible, to blend into the background like the faded floral pattern on the chair. "I'm fine," Janelle murmured, her voice barely a whisper. The words felt hollow, even to her own ears. She wasn't fine. She was a tightly wound spring, coiled so tight she feared she might snap. A long silence settled between them, broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of the clock. Janelle could feel Mrs. Haskins' gaze, a tangible weight pressing against her. She wanted to squirm, to flee back to the anonymity of the crowded hallways, but something held her back. A nascent curiosity, perhaps. A flicker of defiance. Has he done that to other kids? The question slipped out before Janelle could stop it. A small, hesitant ripple disturbing the smooth surface of her carefully cultivated composure. Mrs. Haskins' eyes widened slightly, her expression shifting from gentle concern to something more calculating. She leaned back in her chair, the movement subtle but significant. "We've had a few complaints," she admitted, her voice carefully neutral. "Nothing physical, mostly verbal intimidation. A few complaints." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Janelle pictured Brixton, his swaggering confidence, the way his eyes seemed to scan the room, searching for weakness, for prey. Suddenly, the absence of fear within her shifted, morphing into something colder, harder. The fluorescent lights of the cafeteria hummed, a dull counterpoint to the chaotic symphony of clanging trays and chattering voices. Janelle clutched her lunch tray, its plastic surface slick with condensation. Her stomach, which had been a tight knot all morning, now churned with a different kind of unease. She'd navigated the confusing hallways, survived her first 3 classes, and now faced the final hurdle of her first day, lunchtime. The sheer volume of noise and the press of bodies made her want to retreat, to disappear back into the relative quiet of the library. But her legs, heavy and uncooperative, seemed rooted to the spot. She scanned the room, searching for a familiar face, any anchor in this swirling sea of strangers. Then she saw her. Zadie, her unexpected ally from homeroom, sat at a circular table near the window, her bright pink backpack a beacon in the crowd. Taking a deep breath, Janelle started towards the table, her tray a precarious shield against the jostling students. Each step felt like a victory, a small act of defiance against the overwhelming anxiety that threatened to engulf her. As she approached, Zadie looked up, a wide smile spreading across her face. "Janelle, over here." The warmth in her voice was a surprising balm, easing the tension that had been building in Janelle's chest. Around the table sat 3 other students, 2 girls and a boy, all of whom regarded Janelle with curious gazes. Janelle felt a blush creeping up her neck. Was this what it felt like to be welcomed? To be seen, not as the awkward new girl, but as someone who belonged? The thought, so foreign and yet so enticing, sent a shiver down her spine. "You're the one who stared Brixton Hale in the face," one of the girls said, her voice laced with a mixture of awe and amusement. Her dark eyes sparkled with mischief. "I think you'll survive our table." A ripple of laughter went around the group, and Janelle found herself smiling back, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. The fear that had been a constant companion throughout the morning began to recede, replaced by a tentative sense of hope. Maybe this new school, this unfamiliar place, wouldn't be so bad after all. He deserved it. Zadie chimed in, her voice low but firm. "He's been picking on Kylan for months." She nodded towards the boy at the table, who offered a shy smile in return. His eyes, though downcast, held a flicker of gratitude, a silent acknowledgement of shared experience. Janelle understood that look. She'd seen it reflected in her own mirror countless times, the look of someone who had learned to endure, to weather the storms of unkindness. Suddenly, she felt a kinship with these strangers, a connection forged not in shared laughter or inside jokes, but in the silent understanding of what it meant to be on the receiving end of casual cruelty. The conversation flowed around her, a mix of light-hearted banter and serious discussions about classes and teachers. Janelle listened intently, absorbing the rhythm of their interactions, the subtle cues that signaled friendship and trust. She contributed sparingly, her words carefully chosen, still hesitant to fully immerse herself in this newfound camaraderie. But the warmth of their acceptance, the genuine interest in her opinions, began to chip away at the wall she had built around herself. As they ate, Janelle noticed the subtle glances exchanged between Kylan and Zadie, a silent conversation passing between them. She sensed a hidden layer beneath their light-hearted chatter, a shared secret that bound them together. It was Kylan who finally broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "Brixton used to take my lunch money." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain. Janelle's heart ached for him, for the vulnerability he displayed in sharing this painful truth. She wanted to reach out, to offer a comforting word, but the raw emotion in his voice held her back. She knew, instinctively, that sometimes the greatest comfort lies in simply listening, in bearing witness to another's pain. Zadie placed a comforting hand on Kylan's arm, her gaze unwavering. "We know," she said softly, "and it stops now." There was a steely resolve in her voice, a quiet strength that resonated with Janelle. It was the same strength she had witnessed earlier that morning, the strength to stand up for what was right, even in the face of intimidation. In that moment, Janelle realized that she wasn't just sitting at a lunch table. She was witnessing the birth of a movement, a quiet rebellion against the tyranny of bullies like Brixton. And she, the quiet, introspective new girl, was a part of it. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, and a wave of students surged towards the exit. As Janelle stood up, she felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Zadie, her eyes shining with a newfound intensity. "You'll sit with us tomorrow, right?" she asked, her voice laced with anticipation. Janelle nodded, a shy smile spreading across her face. The anxiety that had plagued her throughout the morning had vanished, replaced by a quiet sense of belonging. She had found her place, her tribe, in the most unexpected of circumstances. The confrontation with Brixton, which had initially filled her with dread, had inadvertently opened a door to a new world, a world where kindness and courage prevailed, where even the quietest voices could be heard. As she walked towards her next class, Janelle's steps were lighter, her heart filled with a sense of purpose. She was no longer just a new girl. She was Janelle, the girl who stood up to a bully, the girl who found her voice, the girl who belonged. The fluorescent lights of the assistant principal's office hummed, a dull, insistent thrum that vibrated in Brixton's ears. The air, thick with the scent of stale coffee and antiseptic cleaner, felt oppressive. He shifted uncomfortably in the hard plastic chair, the slick surface clinging to his jeans. He tried to affect an air of nonchalance, one leg crossed over the other, fingers drumming a restless rhythm against his thigh, but a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. He glanced at the closed door, a thin barrier separating him from the muffled sounds of the school hallway, the echoing clang of locker doors, the distant murmur of voices. He wished he were out there, swallowed up in the anonymity of the crowd, instead of here, under the scrutiny of Ms. Dupree's sharp gaze. "So, Brixton," Ms. Dupree's voice, smooth and controlled, cut through the silence. "We've received 2 reports concerning an incident in Mr. Drummond's homeroom this morning." Her words, seemingly innocuous, pricked at him like tiny needles. 2 reports. He had expected one, maybe, from the new girl, the quiet one with the unsettlingly direct stare. But 2? Who else had seen? A flicker of irritation, quickly suppressed, crossed his face. He forced a casual shrug, a practiced smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "I don't know what they're talking about." He could practically hear his father's voice in his head, a low growl reminding him to stay cool, to play it smart. Don't give them anything. He'd heard it so many times, the words etched into his subconscious. He met Ms. Dupree's gaze, trying to project an image of innocent confusion. Beside Ms. Dupree, Mr. Tilley, the school counselor, leaned forward, his expression a mixture of concern and something else Brixton couldn't quite place. "Why did you grab her arm, Brixton?" The knot in Brixton's stomach tightened. "Grab." The word hung in the air, heavy with accusation. He hadn't grabbed her, not really. More like guided. He'd just been trying to make a point. He just wanted her out of his seat. "I didn't grab her," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I was just frustrated. Frustrated that she hadn't moved, hadn't understood the unspoken rules, the hierarchy of the classroom. Frustrated that she had challenged him, silently, with that steady gaze." Ms. Dupree raised an eyebrow, a silent challenge. She picked up a file from the desk, flipping through the pages. Brixton watched her, a cold dread creeping up his spine. He recognized the file. It was his. He'd seen it before, a thick compendium of past infractions, minor skirmishes and playground disputes that had somehow, inexplicably, accumulated into a damning record. "We've also spoken with Kylan Rivers," Mr. Tilley said softly, his voice a gentle counterpoint to Ms. Dupree's crisp authority. The mention of Kylan's name sent a jolt through Brixton. Kylan, the small, timid kid who always sat in the back of the class, head down, trying to disappear. What had he said? Brixton's carefully constructed facade began to crumble, a hairline fracture spreading across the surface of his composure. Ms. Dupree closed the file with a snap that echoed in the small room. "Kylan tells a different story, Brixton. He says this isn't the first time you've been aggressive with other students." Her words hit him like a physical blow, the air knocked out of his lungs. He stared at her, speechless, his mind racing. Kylan. He'd never even spoken to Kylan. Why would he? A wave of shame washed over him, hot and suffocating. He hadn't thought about it. Not really the impact of his actions on others. He'd been so focused on himself, on maintaining his position, on the thrill of power, that he hadn't considered the consequences, the fear in their eyes, the way they flinched when he approached. He'd seen it, of course, registered it somewhere in the back of his mind, but he'd pushed it away, dismissed it as weakness, as something they deserved. He looked at Mr. Tilley, his face a mask of pleading. He wanted to say something, to explain, to deny, but the words wouldn't come. He felt trapped, exposed, the carefully constructed walls he had built around himself crumbling under the weight of their scrutiny. "Brixton," Mr. Tilley said, his voice laced with genuine concern, "we're not here to punish you. We want to understand why this happened. We want to help you make better choices." Help. The word sounded foreign, alien. No one had ever offered to help him before. They had punished him, reprimanded him, labeled him a troublemaker. But help? The thought, unexpected and unsettling, sparked a flicker of something within him, a fragile ember of hope. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. He began, his voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. He wanted to lie, to deflect, to maintain the pretense of indifference. But something in Mr. Tilley's gaze, a quiet strength, an unwavering belief in his capacity for change, disarmed him. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and for the first time allowed himself to feel the weight of his actions, the pain he had inflicted, the fear he had instilled. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, the words thick with shame and regret. He opened his eyes, meeting Mr. Tilley's gaze. He saw not judgment, but understanding, a glimmer of compassion that pierced through the layers of defensiveness he had so carefully cultivated. And in that moment, something shifted within him, a subtle but profound change, a recognition of the damage he had caused, and a nascent desire to make amends. The journey would be long, arduous, fraught with setbacks and challenges. But for the first time, Brixton felt a flicker of hope, a fragile belief that maybe, just maybe, he could change. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the classroom floor, the light filtering through the dusty blinds in slanted stripes. Room 203, usually a hive of pre-7th period chatter, was unusually subdued. A palpable tension hung in the air, thicker than the lingering scent of stale pizza from lunchtime. Janelle sat at her desk, fingers tracing the worn grooves of the wooden surface. The events of earlier that day replayed in her mind, a carousel of emotions: fear, defiance, then a strange, unsettling calm. She had expected to be invisible, a ghost in the halls of Ridgeview Middle School. Instead, she'd become the unwilling center of a storm. Her stomach twisted with a nervous energy that had nothing to do with hunger. She glanced at Brixton Hale's empty desk a few rows away. The absence felt larger than the boy himself, a void where his boisterous presence usually dominated. She wondered where he was, what he was thinking. Was he plotting revenge? Or maybe, just maybe, was he starting to understand the weight of his actions? The thought, fleeting as it was, sent a shiver down her spine. It was a dangerous thing to hope for change in someone like Brixton. Mr. Drummond cleared his throat, the sound amplified in the unusual quiet. He stood behind his desk, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by a seriousness that caught everyone's attention. He adjusted his glasses, his fingers lingering on the bridge of his nose, a telltale sign of his discomfort. Janelle noticed the way his gaze swept across the room, lingering for a beat on Brixton's empty desk, then finally settling on her. She quickly averted her eyes, focusing on the intricate patterns in the wood grain of her desk. The weight of all those gazes, the silent whisper she imagined circulating through the room, pressed down on her like a physical burden. "All right, class," Mr. Drummond began, his voice a low rumble that resonated through the room. "What happened earlier today isn't something we're brushing aside." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. Janelle felt her heart thump against her ribs. The silence was heavy, pregnant with unspoken anxieties. She could practically feel the collective breath held in the room. Mr. Drummond continued, his voice gaining strength. "This classroom," he said, his gaze sweeping across the faces of his students, "this school is a place of learning. It's a place where everyone deserves to feel safe and respected. This classroom doesn't belong to any one person. It belongs to all of us. His words echoed in the quiet room, each syllable landing with a surprising weight. Janelle risked a glance at Zadie, who sat 2 rows over, her chin held high, a small, almost imperceptible nod of agreement. It was a small gesture, but it sent a ripple of warmth through Janelle's chest. She wasn't alone. Mr. Drummond's words, seemingly simple, felt revolutionary in the context of their small, contained world. He was drawing a line in the sand, challenging the unspoken hierarchy that had allowed Brixton's behavior to go unchecked for so long. It was a shift in the tectonic plates of their social landscape. Janelle closed her eyes for a moment, letting the implications of Mr. Drummond's statement sink in. It was more than just a reprimand. It was a promise, a declaration of a new order. It was a fragile hope taking root in the barren landscape of fear and intimidation that had defined her first day at Ridgeview. In the back of the room, Kylan Rivers shifted in his seat. He had witnessed countless acts of aggression from Brixton, each incident etching itself onto his memory like a scar. He had remained silent, paralyzed by fear, convinced that speaking up would only make him a target. But something had shifted today. Seeing Janelle's quiet defiance, her refusal to cower, had sparked a flicker of courage within him. He felt a strange mix of relief and trepidation. The truth was out. The dam had broken. Mr. Drummond continued, his voice resonating with a newfound authority. Bullying, he stated firmly, will not be tolerated in this classroom. Period. The finality in his voice left no room for argument. He outlined the school's policies against bullying, his words precise and clear. He spoke of consequences, of restorative justice, of creating a safe learning environment for everyone. He spoke of respect, not just for teachers, but for each other. His words, though directed at the entire class, felt intensely personal to Janelle. She had unwittingly become a catalyst, her quiet act of defiance sparking a chain reaction that was reshaping the dynamics of the entire classroom. It was a heavy burden to bear, but also, strangely, empowering. She had never considered herself brave, but perhaps she thought bravery wasn't about grand gestures. Perhaps it was about the quiet strength to simply say, "No." The bell rang, signaling the end of the period, but the silence lingered for a moment longer. Students slowly began to gather their belongings, the usual cacophony of chatter replaced by hushed whispers. The atmosphere was still charged, but the tension had shifted, morphing into something else, something akin to anticipation. The status quo had been disrupted, and the aftershocks were still rippling through the room. As Janelle walked out of room 203, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Zadie standing beside her, a small, knowing smile on her face. "You did good," Zadie said, her voice soft but firm. Janelle simply nodded, a lump forming in her throat. The words were simple, but they held a profound weight. They were a validation, a recognition of the unspoken battle that had been fought and, in a small way, won. The first day at Ridgeview had been far from what she had expected, but as she walked down the crowded hallway, she realized that sometimes the most unexpected events can lead to the most profound changes. The fear still lingered, but it was now intertwined with a newfound sense of hope, a flicker of belief that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. The chipped ceramic mug warmed Janelle's hands, the chamomile tea a faint, floral whisper against the rising tide of unease within her. Evening had settled over her aunt's living room, the shadows lengthening across the worn floral rug, mimicking the tendrils of anxiety that tightened around her chest. The silence of the house, usually a balm, now felt heavy, pregnant with the lingering echoes of the day's events. Brixton Hale. The name, sharp and jagged, reverberated in the quiet spaces of her mind. She saw again the flash of anger in his eyes, the curl of his lip, the way he held himself, like a coiled spring ready to unleash. Had she made a mistake? The question gnawed at her, a persistent, insidious doubt. Her aunt, bless her heart, had tried to reassure her. "You did the right thing, Janelle," she'd said, squeezing her shoulder. But the right thing felt so wrong. It felt exposed, vulnerable, like standing alone in a spotlight, the target of unseen eyes. The faint rustle of paper broke through her reverie. Tucked beneath the edge of her math textbook, almost hidden, was a folded note. Her heart quickened, a nervous flutter against her ribs. She hadn't noticed it before. Hesitantly, she reached for it, her fingers tracing the crisp edges. Who could have left it? And why? The possibilities spun in her mind, each more unsettling than the last. Was it a threat? A warning? Another layer of the strange, unsettling game that had begun that morning? With a deep breath, she unfolded the paper, the simple act feeling monumental, like peeling back a bandage to reveal a hidden wound. The handwriting was small, cramped, the letters leaning into each other as if seeking comfort. There were no greetings, no salutations, just a single stark sentence. "He's been like that to me." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Janelle reread the sentence, her mind struggling to grasp the full weight of it. Like that. The casual phrasing belied the depth of pain it implied. It spoke of a pattern, a history, a cycle of hurt that she had unknowingly disrupted. A wave of guilt washed over her, a cold, unwelcome sensation. Had she made things worse for someone else? The silence of the room pressed in on her, suffocating. She closed her eyes, trying to conjure the faces of her classmates, searching for a clue, a hint of who might have written the note. But the faces blurred, a sea of anonymity, each one a potential source of the hidden message. The anonymity itself was unsettling. It spoke of fear, of a pervasive unease that extended beyond her own experience. It was the silence of complicity, the unspoken agreement to endure rather than confront. And suddenly, Janelle understood. She wasn't alone. Her solitary act of defiance had cracked the surface of something much larger, something dark and insidious that had been festering beneath the surface of Ridgeview Middle School. Her initial anxiety morphed into something else, something akin to anger, a quiet, simmering rage at the injustice, at the unspoken fear that had allowed Brixton's behavior to continue unchecked. She thought of Zadie, her tentative smile, her whispered words of support. Had she, too, endured Brixton's taunts? The thought twisted in her gut, a knot of discomfort and burgeoning protectiveness. She imagined the countless small acts of aggression, the whispered insults, the subtle threats that had gone unnoticed, unchallenged. How many others had suffered in silence, afraid to speak out, afraid to become the next target? The mug trembled in her hands, the tea sloshing over the rim. She set it down on the coffee table, the small clink echoing in the sudden stillness. The weight of the note in her hand felt heavier now, a tangible representation of the burden she now carried. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about them, the unseen, unheard voices that had finally found a crack in the wall of silence. A flicker of resolve ignited within her, a small flame in the darkness. Fear still lingered, a cold shadow at the edges of her awareness. But it was no longer the dominant emotion. Something else had taken root, something stronger, more resilient. A sense of purpose, a determination to see this through, to ensure that those hidden voices were finally heard. She carefully folded the note, tucking it into the pocket of her jeans, a tangible reminder of the responsibility she now carried. The room no longer felt oppressive, the silence no longer heavy. It was simply quiet, a space for reflection, a canvas upon which to paint a new narrative. The narrative of a girl who had stumbled into a battle she hadn't sought, but one she was now determined to fight. Not just for herself, but for all those who had suffered in silence, waiting for someone to break the cycle. And in the quiet of her aunt's living room, Janelle knew, with a certainty that resonated deep within her bones, that she wouldn't back down. She would find a way to make their voices heard. She would find a way to make things right. The fluorescent lights of room 203 hummed, a dull counterpoint to the nervous flutter in Janelle's stomach. Morning light filtered through the dusty blinds, cast long stripes across the worn linoleum floor. She sat perched on the edge of her chair, the plastic digging into her thighs, a stark contrast to the storm raging within her. It had barely been 24 hours since the incident with Brixton, yet the weight of it clung to her like a second skin. She kept replaying the scene, the way his face had twisted, the hush that had fallen over the cafeteria, the sudden, surprising surge of her own voice. Had she done the right thing? The uncertainty gnawed at her. Across the small, circular table sat Brixton, his usual swagger replaced by a sullen silence. His gaze was fixed on the worn surface, his fingers drumming a restless tattoo. The air crackled with an unspoken tension, thick and suffocating. He looked smaller somehow, stripped of his usual bravado. Janelle found herself feeling a strange mix of apprehension and pity. The thought startled her. Could she possibly feel sorry for someone who had caused her so much distress? Mr. Drummond, their homeroom teacher, fidgeted with a stack of papers, his brow furrowed. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the tense silence. "So," he began, his voice strained, "we're here today to talk things through." He glanced nervously at Mrs. Haskins, the school counselor, who sat beside him, her expression calm and professional. Janelle could feel the weight of their gazes, the expectation hanging heavy in the air. Beside her, a chair scraped against the floor. Kylan Rivers, the boy who had slipped her the note the previous day, shifted in his seat. His eyes, usually downcast, met hers for a fleeting moment, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. He took a deep breath, his thin shoulders rising and falling. The air in the room seemed to hold its breath. "I wrote the note," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air, fragile and unexpected. Janelle's head snapped towards him, surprise warring with a sudden understanding. She had wondered who had sent her that message of support, that small beacon in the storm. To see it was Kylan, the quietest boy in the class, the one who always seemed to fade in the background, sent a shiver down her spine. What had driven him to speak up now? Brixton finally looked up, his eyes narrowed, a flicker of anger igniting in their depths. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but Kylan, in a voice gaining strength, continued. "Sixth grade," he said, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the wall. "He slammed me into a locker that stole my lunch money. Told everyone to wet myself." His voice cracked, but he pressed on. "He said if I told anyone, he'd do it again, only worse." The words tumbled out, raw and ragged, each syllable carrying the weight of years of suppressed fear. The silence that followed was deafening. Janelle's breath hitched. She could almost feel the cold metal of the locker against her own back, the humiliation burning in her throat. She glanced at Brixton, whose face had drained of color. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a stark vulnerability that made her stomach clench. Mrs. Haskins leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Kylan, thank you for sharing that. It takes a lot of courage." Her words seemed to hang in the air, a lifeline thrown into the turbulent waters of the room. She turned to Brixton, her gaze unwavering. "Brixton, do you have anything to say about this?" He remained silent, his gaze fixed on the table, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge. The silence stretched, each tick of the clock amplifying the tension. Janelle watched him, her mind racing. Was he remorseful? Ashamed? Or simply calculating his next move? Finally, he spoke, his voice low and barely audible. It was a long time ago. The words were hollow, devoid of any real emotion. A long time ago, Kylan's voice, though still trembling, held a newfound steel. "It's not something you forget." He looked directly at Brixton, his eyes blazing with a quiet intensity that Janelle had never seen before. "I still check over my shoulder in the hallways. I still flinch when someone comes up behind me. A long time ago doesn't erase what happened." The raw honesty of Kylan's words hung in the air, a stark indictment. Janelle felt a wave of empathy wash over her, so intense it almost brought tears to her eyes. She had only experienced Brixton's aggression for a single day, but Kylan had lived with the fear of it for years. The realization solidified something within her. Her initial apprehension about confronting Brixton vanished, replaced by a quiet certainty that she had done the right thing. Not just for herself, but for Kylan and perhaps for others who hadn't yet found their voice. Mrs. Haskins addressed the room, her voice calm and steady, cutting through the charged atmosphere. "This is a difficult situation," she acknowledged, "but it's also an opportunity. An opportunity to understand the impact of our actions, to take responsibility, and to begin the process of healing." Her words resonated with Janelle, a beacon of hope in the swirling emotions of the room. This wasn't just about punishment, she realized. It was about something more profound, something that touched on the very core of who they were as individuals and as a community. The muted ticking of the clock on Mrs. Haskins' wall seemed to amplify the silence in the small, softly lit room. Janelle sat perched on the edge of a plush armchair, its worn fabric a testament to countless similar conversations, similar anxieties held within its embrace. The scent of lavender, perhaps from a diffuser tucked away on a shelf, hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of fear that still clung to the back of Janelle's throat. Across from her, Kylan Rivers, a boy whose name she barely knew, hunched into himself, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond Mrs. Haskins' kind, concerned face. Janelle traced the outline of a faded flower on the armchair with her fingertip, a small, repetitive motion to anchor herself against the swirling currents of the afternoon's events. It was strange, unsettling to be here in the counselor's office, a place that had always seemed like another world, a world for other kids, not for her. But then, this whole day had felt like another world. Mrs. Haskins' voice, soft yet steady, broke the silence. "Kylan, Janelle tells me you've had some unpleasant experiences with Brixton as well." Her words hung in the air, a gentle invitation. Janelle glanced at Kylan, surprised. She hadn't realized he was involved. He flinched at Mrs. Haskins' words, as if they were a physical touch, and Janelle felt a sudden kinship with him, a shared understanding of the way fear could burrow deep inside, leaving you feeling small and exposed. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "It wasn't anything big," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. The lie hung thick between them, a tangible thing. Janelle recognized it. She'd told similar lies herself, trying to minimize, to downplay, to make the hurt seem smaller than it was. "Kylan," Mrs. Haskins' voice was gentle but firm, "it's important to be honest. What happened?" He looked at Janelle then, a flicker of something desperation, hope, in his eyes. And in that look, Janelle saw a reflection of her own fear, her own reluctance to speak. She knew, with a sudden certainty, that whatever Kylan had endured, it hadn't been small. Not at all. He took a shaky breath. "He tripped me in the hallway once," he stammered, his gaze dropping back to his hands. And he took my lunch money a couple of times." He paused, his voice catching in his throat. He said I was lucky he didn't take more." Janelle's stomach twisted. The casual cruelty in Brixton's words echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder of the power he wielded, the fear he instilled. She thought of the way he'd looked at her, the cold amusement in his eyes, and a wave of nausea washed over her. Mrs. Haskins leaned forward, her expression concerned. "Did you tell anyone, Kylan?" He shook his head, his cheeks flushing crimson. "No," he said, "if I told, it would be worse." The silence returned, heavy and oppressive. Janelle felt a surge of anger, a hot, burning ember in her chest. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Kylan, and probably others too. Students whose names she didn't know, whose stories she hadn't heard. Students who, like her, had suffered in silence. "It wasn't just about the seat, Mrs. Haskins," Janelle said, her voice surprisingly steady. She hadn't meant to speak. The words just tumbled out, driven by the anger and the growing sense of injustice. She saw Kylan's head snap up, surprise etched on his face. Mrs. Haskins' eyebrows rose slightly. "What do you mean, Janelle?" Janelle hesitated, the fear returning, a cold hand squeezing her chest. But then she thought of Kylan, of the fear in his eyes, and the anger pushed the fear aside. "He wasn't just being mean," she said, her voice gaining strength. He was testing people, seeing who would fold. He wanted to see who he could intimidate. Mrs. Haskins listened intently, her gaze unwavering. "And what made you decide not to fold, Janelle?" Janelle thought about that, searching for the answer. It wasn't courage, not really. It was something else, something deeper, something that had risen within her, a quiet defiance she hadn't known she possessed. I just got tired of being afraid," she whispered, the words barely audible. A flicker of understanding crossed Mrs. Haskins' face. She nodded slowly, her gaze shifting from Janelle to Kylan and back again. "Thank you both for sharing this with me," she said, her voice laced with a new gravity. "This is important, very important." The ticking of the clock seemed to slow, each tick marking the weight of their words, the weight of the truth that had finally been spoken aloud. In the quiet of the counselor's office, something had shifted, a line had been crossed. Janelle didn't know what would happen next, but she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that things would never be quite the same again. The lavender scent, once a soothing presence, now felt suffocating, a reminder of the contained space, the contained emotions. She needed air, needed space to breathe, to process the swirling emotions that churned within her. She glanced at Kylan, his shoulders slumped slightly, but his head held a fraction higher than before. A small, almost imperceptible nod passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the shared burden they had carried, and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. The fluorescent lights of Ridge View Middle School hummed, a monotonous soundtrack to Janelle's week. Each flicker felt like a strobe light, capturing the fragmented memories of Monday's confrontation. The echo of Brixton's raised voice, the scrape of the chair legs against the linoleum, the sudden, stunned silence they all played on repeat in the quiet corners of her mind. She walked the hallways with her head down, her gaze fixed on the worn tiles, each step measured and cautious. Just blend in, she told herself, become invisible. But the whispers followed her, clinging to her like shadows. Some were sympathetic, others laced with a strange sort of awe. She was no longer just the new girl. She was the girl who stood up to Brixton Hale. Brixton himself was absent. The throne of his usual seat remained unoccupied, a silent testament to the disruption he'd caused. Mr. Drummond, their homeroom teacher, seemed to avoid the topic entirely, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by a thin veneer of awkwardness. The air in the classroom crackled with unspoken questions, with the weight of something shifted, something changed. The change wasn't immediate, not a dramatic upheaval, but a subtle ripple spreading through the stagnant waters of Ridge View's social hierarchy. On Tuesday, a small group of girls, their faces etched with a hesitant curiosity, approached Janelle by her locker. "That was something," one of them mumbled, her eyes darting around as if expecting Brixton to materialize out of thin air. Janelle just nodded, a tight knot forming in her stomach. The attention was suffocating. "They don't understand," she thought. "They think I'm brave, but I was just there." Wednesday brought a summons to the principal's office. The sterile environment, the faint scent of disinfectant, amplified her anxiety. Mrs. Lane, the principal, sat behind her large, imposing desk, her expression unreadable. "You've been through a lot this week, Janelle," she began, her voice surprisingly gentle. Janelle's hands clenched in her lap. This is it, she thought. They're going to punish me for causing trouble. But Mrs. Lane's next word surprised her. "I see you, Janelle," she continued, leaning forward, her gaze steady and unwavering. "And I see the courage it takes to speak when staying quiet is easier." A warmth, unexpected and unfamiliar, spread through Janelle's chest. It wasn't praise, not exactly, but something deeper, a recognition of the silent battle she'd fought within herself. The ripples continued to spread. On Thursday, during lunch, a boy named Kylan Rivers, small and almost perpetually hunched, approached her. He'd always been one of Brixton's targets, a shadow flitting through the hallways, trying to avoid notice. He stood before her, his hands fidgeting, his voice barely a whisper. "He did that to me, too," he confessed, his eyes downcast. Last year, he took my lunch money, and his voice trailed off, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. Janelle looked at him, truly saw him for the first time. The fear in his eyes mirrored her own, the shame, the vulnerability. She reached out, a silent gesture of solidarity. He flinched, then slowly, hesitantly, met her gaze. A single tear rolled down his cheek. "Thank you," he whispered, the words choked with emotion. And then others started to speak. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into voices. Stories emerged from the shadows, tales of stolen belongings, of taunts and shoves, of the constant, oppressive weight of Brixton's reign. Zadie, the girl who had defended Janelle on Monday, stood by her side, her hand a reassuring presence on Janelle's arm. "See?" she whispered. "You're not alone." The administration, prompted by the growing chorus of voices, launched a formal investigation. Brixton's actions, once shrouded in the silence of fear and intimidation, were now brought into the harsh light of scrutiny. The school counselor, Mrs. Haskins, a woman with kind eyes and a calming presence, became a central figure in the unfolding drama. She met with Janelle, with Kylan, with the others who had come forward, their stories weaving a tapestry of shared pain and suppressed anger. The culmination of this week of whispers and revelations was a restorative meeting. Janelle sat across from Brixton, the space between them charged with unspoken emotions. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by a sullen silence, his gaze fixed on the table. His parents, their faces etched with a mixture of disbelief and shame, sat beside him. Janelle's own parents, their hands clasped tightly together, flanked her, their presence a silent source of strength. Mrs. Haskins guided the conversation, her voice calm and steady, creating a space for dialogue, for understanding, for healing. Brixton, prompted by his parents and Mrs. Haskins, finally spoke, his voice low and hesitant. He admitted to his actions, acknowledging the hurt he had caused. He didn't offer excuses, not exactly, but a glimpse into his own insecurities, his own desperate need for control. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but a crack in the wall he had built around himself. Janelle listened, her heart a battlefield of conflicting emotions. Anger, yes, but also a flicker of something else, something akin to pity. She saw the boy beneath the bravado, the wounded child hiding behind the mask of aggression. She didn't forgive him, not yet, but she understood, on some level, the complex web of emotions that had driven him. The meeting ended with a tentative agreement, a commitment to further dialogue, to repairing the damage that had been done. As Janelle walked out of the room, the weight on her chest felt lighter, the shadows less oppressive. The silence in the hallways was different now, no longer heavy with fear, but pregnant with the possibility of change. The ripples had become waves, washing over Ridgeview, reshaping the landscape, creating a space for new beginnings. The squeak of rubber against asphalt, the rhythmic rumble of the engine, the cacophony of chattering voices the school bus was a microcosm of Ridgeview Middle School, a contained chaos Janelle hadn't quite adjusted to yet. She sat near the back, her gaze fixed on the blurring landscape outside the window. Trees morphed into houses, houses into shops, a fleeting panorama of a town she was still trying to decipher. The incident with Brixton Hale felt like a lifetime ago, yet the weight of it settled heavily in her stomach, a knot of anxiety she couldn't quite unravel. Had she done the right thing? The question echoed in the hollow spaces of her mind. She'd never intended to become the center of attention, to disrupt the delicate balance of this new environment. All she wanted was to blend in, to become invisible against the vibrant tapestry of middle school life. A folded piece of paper landed lightly on her lap. Her fingers, still trembling slightly from the residual adrenaline, unfolded the note. 3 simple words, written in a hurried scrawl, stared back at her. "Thank you for not folding." Her eyes darted around the bus, searching for the sender. Kylan Rivers, the boy who'd been sketching in the corner of the library yesterday, met her gaze. He offered a hesitant smile, then quickly averted his eyes, his cheeks flushing a delicate pink. A wave of warmth washed over Janelle, chasing away the lingering chill of apprehension. Someone had seen. Someone had understood. The note was a small act, a silent gesture, yet it held immense weight. It was a validation of her actions, a whisper of solidarity in the swirling vortex of whispers and rumors. The knot in her stomach loosened, replaced by a flicker of something akin to hope. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in this. The whispers on the bus were a constant hum, a background noise to her internal monologue. She caught snippets of conversations, fragments of Brixton's name, laced with a mix of awe, fear, and now, something new, disbelief. The carefully constructed facade of the school bully was crumbling, revealing the cracks beneath. The incident in Mr. Drummond's class had been a catalyst, a pebble thrown into the still waters of Ridgeview, creating ripples that spread further than she could have imagined. It was as if her quiet act of defiance had given others permission to speak, to share their own stories, their own encounters with Brixton's aggression. She'd unintentionally become a symbol, a beacon of resistance in a landscape where conformity often reigned supreme. The bus lurched to a stop, the doors hissing open, releasing a wave of students into the afternoon sun. Janelle lingered for a moment, watching as Kylan hurried off the bus, his head down, his shoulders hunched as if carrying a heavy burden. The image resonated with her, a reflection of her own internal struggles. She, too, felt the weight of unspoken words, the burden of anxieties she hadn't yet learned to articulate. But now there was a subtle shift, a glimmer of understanding. She wasn't just carrying her own weight anymore. She was carrying the weight of others' hopes, their silent pleas for change. And somehow, that weight felt less like a burden and more like a shared responsibility. The air outside the bus was crisp and cool, a stark contrast to the stuffy confines of the vehicle. As she walked towards her house, Janelle replayed the events of the day in her mind, dissecting each moment, each interaction. Mr. Drummond's initial inaction, his delayed response, had left a bitter taste in her mouth. She'd expected him to be a protector, a shield against the harsh realities of the schoolyard. But he'd been caught off guard, his authority undermined by Brixton's ingrained dominance. It was Mrs. Haskins, the school counselor, who had stepped in, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the swirling chaos of the classroom. She had listened, truly listened, to both sides of the story, her eyes holding a depth of understanding that went beyond the superficial. She hadn't just addressed the immediate conflict. She'd delved deeper, unearthing the root of the problem, the pattern of Brixton's behavior. The restorative meeting loomed large in her mind, a daunting prospect. Facing Brixton again, in the presence of their parents, felt like another confrontation, a different kind of battle. Yet Mrs. Haskins' words echoed in her ears. It's not about punishment, Janelle. It's about understanding, about finding a way to move forward. The thought of facing Brixton's parents filled her with a new wave of anxiety. What would they think of her? Would they see her as the instigator, the one who had disrupted their son's life? She'd seen the flicker of shame in Brixton's eyes, the vulnerability that peeked through his carefully constructed mask of arrogance. It was a fleeting moment, quickly replaced by a hardened expression, a defensive wall erected to protect his wounded pride. But she'd seen it, that crack in his armor, and it had left a lingering impression. He wasn't just a bully. He was a complex individual, a boy grappling with his own internal demons. The restorative meeting wasn't just about him. It was about her too. It was about confronting her own fears, her own insecurities, and finding her voice in a world that often tried to silence her. As she reached her doorstep, Janelle took a deep breath, steeling herself for the challenges that lay ahead. The support of her peers, the unexpected kindness of strangers, had given her a newfound strength, a quiet resilience that she hadn't known she possessed. The journey was far from over, but she was no longer walking it alone. The ripples she'd created were expanding, touching the lives of others, creating a wave of change that she hoped would wash over Ridgeview, cleansing the murky waters and bringing a new clarity to the surface. The Monday morning air hung heavy, a stark contrast to the crisp autumn day just a week ago. The hallways of Ridge View Middle School buzzed with a subdued energy, the usual cacophony muted, replaced by whispers and sidelong glances. Janelle Carter walked with her head down, the weight of the past week pressing on her like a physical burden. She'd become an unwitting symbol, a quiet storm that had disrupted the school's delicate ecosystem. Her stomach churned, a knot of anxiety tightening with each step closer to Mrs. Haskins' office. Just breathe, Janelle, just breathe. The mantra, her mother's soothing voice echoing in her mind, did little to calm the tremor in her hands. Brixton Hale sat hunched in a chair outside the counselor's office, his usual swagger replaced by a quiet stillness. The hallway's whispers, he knew, were about him. He could feel their weight, the judgment in their hushed tones. His suspension, the forced introspection, had chipped away at the carefully constructed wall of indifference he'd built around himself. He hadn't slept properly in days. The shame, a foreign and uncomfortable sensation, gnawed at him. He'd seen the fear in Janelle's eyes, a reflection of the fear he himself carried within, a fear he masked with aggression. He ran a hand through his hair, the gelled spikes now limp and lifeless, mirroring his own depleted spirit. This wasn't supposed to happen. The thought echoed in the hollow space of his mind. He was Brixton Hale. He was supposed to be in control. Mr. and Mrs. Carter sat beside Janelle in Mrs. Haskins' office, their presence a comforting anchor in the swirling sea of her emotions. Across from them, Brixton sat flanked by his parents. The air crackled with unspoken tension, thick and suffocating. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to amplify the silence. Janelle's eyes darted around the room, avoiding direct contact. The floral scent of Mrs. Haskins' air freshener, usually comforting, felt cloying, adding to the sense of unease. She focused on the rhythmic tap of her foot against the carpet, a small, private rebellion against the suffocating stillness. Just get this over with, she pleaded silently. Mrs. Haskins, her voice calm and measured, broke the silence. This isn't about punishment. It's about ownership and healing. Her gaze swept across the room, holding each person's eyes for a moment. Janelle felt a warmth spread through her chest at the counselor's words, a small flicker of hope in the oppressive atmosphere. Brixton's father shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He's already been suspended, hasn't he? What more do you want? The words, sharp and defensive, hung in the air. Mrs. Haskins' expression remained neutral. Suspension addresses the behavior, not the root cause. We need to understand what happened, why it happened, and how we can prevent it from happening again. Brixton's mother, her face etched with worry, placed a hand on his arm. He flinched slightly at her touch. The subtle movement didn't escape Janelle's notice. He's scared, she realized, a flicker of surprise mingling with the lingering fear. Brixton stared at his hands, the knuckles white as he clenched them. He felt a pressure building in his chest, a tightness that made it hard to breathe. Just say something, anything. He swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. I messed up and I'm sorry. The words felt inadequate, hollow even to his own ears. He risked a glance at Janelle, her face unreadable. Janelle's mind raced. Sorry? Is that all? She thought of the fear she'd felt, the humiliation. She thought of Zadie's quiet support, of Kylan's whispered confession of Brixton's past bullying. Suddenly, the quiet girl who had spent her life trying to blend into the background felt a surge of unexpected strength. She looked directly at Brixton, her voice steady. You didn't just grab me. You wanted to control me. The silence that followed was deafening. Brixton flinched as if struck. His mother's hand tightened on his arm. He looked up, his eyes meeting Janelle's for the first time since the incident. He saw not fear, but a quiet resolve, a strength he hadn't expected. For the first time, he understood the impact of his actions, the weight of his words, the fear he instilled in others. He saw himself, not as the powerful figure he pretended to be, but as the scared, insecure boy he truly was. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. I didn't, I mean, he stumbled over his words, the carefully constructed facade crumbling around him. The meeting continued for another hour, a slow, painful unraveling of misunderstandings, of unspoken fears and insecurities. Janelle, emboldened by her newfound voice, spoke of the anxiety she felt as the new kid, the pressure to be invisible. Brixton, stripped bare of his bravado, spoke of the pressure he felt to maintain his image, the fear of showing weakness. As the meeting concluded, a fragile understanding began to emerge. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start, a crack in the wall of resentment, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. As Janelle left the office, she felt a lightness in her step, a sense of release. She wasn't just a quiet new girl anymore. She was Janelle Carter, the girl who had spoken up, the girl who had refused to be controlled. And in that moment, she knew that she would never be silent again. The whispers in the hallway, she realized, had changed. They were no longer whispers of judgment, but murmurs of admiration, of solidarity, of a quiet revolution sparked by a single act of defiance. The glow of the laptop screen painted Janelle's face in a cool, ethereal light. Outside, the early evening hummed with a quiet symphony of crickets and distant car engines. Her room, usually a sanctuary of organized chaos, felt strangely still, holding its breath. The events of the day, the confrontation, the principal's office, the hushed whispers in the hallways, played on a continuous loop in her mind. It was a dizzying carousel she couldn't quite step off. She absently chewed on the edge of her thumbnail, a nervous habit she'd thought she'd conquered. Opening her email, she expected the usual spam, maybe a flyer for the school's upcoming bake sale. What she found instead was a cascade of messages, each one a pebble rippling the placid surface of her carefully constructed anonymity. The first email was from Mira Barlow, a girl she vaguely recognized from her math class. "I saw what you did today," the email began. Janelle's stomach tightened. Was this a reprimand, a warning? She scrolled down, her breath catching in her throat. "You stood up to him. You made me feel like I could." Janelle stared at the words, unblinking. A strange warmth bloomed in her chest, a feeling so unfamiliar it bordered on discomfort. Mira went on to describe how Brixton had taunted her relentlessly for weeks, how his words had chipped away at her confidence, leaving her feeling small and insignificant. "I was too scared to say anything," Mira confessed. "But watching you, it gave me hope." Janelle closed her eyes, the weight of Mira's words settling deep within her. She hadn't intended to be a beacon of hope, a symbol of defiance. She just wanted to be left alone, to blend into the background, a shadow among shadows. The idea that her actions had touched someone else, had given them strength, was both unsettling and strangely exhilarating. It was like accidentally stumbling upon a hidden door in a familiar room, a door leading to a place she hadn't known existed. Another email popped up, this one from Mr. Drummond, her homeroom teacher. He apologized for not intervening sooner, admitting he'd been caught off guard by the intensity of the situation. "You reminded me today why I started teaching," he wrote. "Sometimes it's easy to get lost in the lesson plans and the grading, to forget the real reason we're here. Thank you for reminding me." Janelle reread the message, a flicker of a smile playing on her lips. Mr. Drummond, with his perpetually rumpled suits and his distracted air, had always seemed ordinary. This email revealed a depth she hadn't anticipated. As she scrolled through her inbox, she found messages from other students, some she knew, some she didn't. Each email echoed a similar sentiment, a shared experience of fear and intimidation, of feeling powerless in the face of Brixton's aggression. They thanked her, not for being a hero, but for simply being brave. The quiet, introspective girl who preferred the company of books to people had become, inadvertently, a catalyst for change. The final email, the one that resonated the most, was from Kylan Rivers. He was a boy who always sat alone in the back of the library, his face perpetually hidden behind a thick curtain of dark hair. Janelle had only exchanged a few words with him, but she'd sensed a kindred spirit, a shared preference for silence and solitude. Some people break things, he wrote. You fix them. The words were simple, yet profound. They pierced through the layers of her self-doubt, her ingrained belief that she was invisible, insignificant. Janelle leaned back in her chair, the laptop's warmth radiating against her legs. The room no longer felt still. It vibrated with a newfound energy, a sense of purpose she hadn't known she craved. The fear and anxiety that had clung to her like a second skin began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet strength, a nascent understanding of her own power. She wasn't just a shadow anymore. She was a reflection, a mirror reflecting the unspoken fears and hopes of others. The realization was both daunting and liberating. She closed her laptop, the echoes of their words resonating in the quiet of her room. The crickets outside chirped their nightly serenade, their song no longer a backdrop to her anxieties, but a testament to the resilience of life, the quiet persistence of hope. The world outside her window seemed different now, sharper, more vibrant. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing the intricate tapestry of human connection, the unseen threads that bound them together. And within that tapestry, Janelle realized she had a place. She had a voice. The fluorescent lights of room 203 hummed, a monotonous drone that mirrored the low thrum of anxiety in Janelle's chest. She sat in the same seat, the worn wooden desk cool beneath her fingertips. Yesterday, this room had been a battleground. Today, it felt different, emptier, somehow, even though most of the faces were the same. The air, thick with the scent of pencil shavings and stale air conditioning, held a new tension, a quiet expectancy that prickled her skin. She kept her gaze fixed on the open pages of her textbook, the words blurring into meaningless shapes. She could feel the weight of unseen eyes, the silent whispers that danced around her like phantom limbs. Had she done the right thing? The question, a persistent splinter in her mind, refused to be dislodged. She'd replayed the events of the previous day countless times, each iteration a slightly distorted reflection in a cracked mirror. The tremor in her voice as she'd refused to move. The surprised widening of Brixton's eyes. The stunned silence of the classroom. It felt like a lifetime ago, and yet the residue of the confrontation clung to her like a second skin. The squeak of the door hinges jolted her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a trapped bird desperate for escape. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. The sudden hush that fell over the room, the almost imperceptible intake of breath, the subtle shifting of bodies, these were all the heralds of Brixton Hale's arrival. He paused in the doorway, a silhouette against the bright hallway, his usual swagger noticeably absent. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met. His were dark, unreadable, like the surface of a frozen lake. Then, he looked away, a flicker of something shame, uncertainty, crossing his face before it was quickly masked. He walked to the back of the room, choosing a desk in the far corner, his back to the class. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until Mr. Drummond bustled in, his cheerful "Good morning, class" sounding jarringly out of place. Janelle tried to focus on the lesson, but the words seemed to slide off her mind like water off oil. Her peripheral vision caught the occasional glance in her direction, some curious, some admiring, some laced with a hint of fear. Zadie, seated a few rows away, offered a small, encouraging smile. It was a lifeline, a silent acknowledgement of the shared experience, and Janelle clung to it like a drowning sailor to a piece of driftwood. She knew she wasn't alone. The whispers had changed. They weren't about her anymore. They were about him, about the cracks that had appeared in the carefully constructed facade of Brixton Hale, the invincible king of Ridge View Middle School. Later, during lunch break, Kylan Rivers, a small, almost invisible boy with perpetually hunched shoulders, approached her. He stood awkwardly before her, his eyes downcast, fidgeting with the strap of his backpack. Janelle?" he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to say thank you." He wouldn't meet her eyes, his cheeks flushed a deep crimson. Janelle, surprised, could only manage a small nod, her own throat suddenly tight. Kylan's words, though few, carried the weight of unspoken stories, of past hurts and endured injustices. She realized then that her actions had reverberated beyond her own immediate sphere, creating ripples in the stagnant water of the school's social hierarchy. Other students, emboldened by her quiet defiance, had begun to speak up, sharing their own experiences with Brixton's bullying. The whispers had become voices, small at first, then growing in strength and volume. The truth, once hidden in the shadows, was now out in the open. The following week, Mrs. Haskins, the school counselor, called Janelle and Brixton into her office. The room was small and brightly lit, the air thick with the scent of lavender and something vaguely medicinal. Brixton sat opposite her, his posture stiff, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the wall. He looked smaller, somehow, stripped of his usual arrogance. Janelle could almost feel the weight of his shame, a palpable presence in the room. Mrs. Haskins, her voice calm and reassuring, guided them through a restorative conversation, a carefully orchestrated dance of apologies and acknowledgments. Janelle, surprised by her own lack of anger, spoke of the fear she'd felt, the unsettling realization that her carefully constructed world of invisibility could be shattered in an instant. Brixton, his voice low and hesitant, admitted to his actions, the words seeming to be dragged from him like confessions extracted under duress. He spoke of the pressure he felt to maintain his image, the fear of losing his status, the insidious cycle of aggression that had become his default response. He didn't offer excuses, but his words painted a picture of a boy trapped in a prison of his own making. The meeting ended with a handshake, a tentative bridge built across a chasm of misunderstanding. As Janelle walked out of the office, she felt a strange sense of lightness, a burden lifted. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that the whispers wouldn't disappear overnight. But something had shifted, something fundamental. The silence in room 203 was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of understanding, of a shared experience that had, in its own strange way, brought them closer. It was the silence of a new beginning. And in that silence, Janelle found her voice, a quiet strength that resonated within her, a whisper that promised to become a roar. She had discovered that sometimes the smallest act of courage can have the biggest impact. A single pebble dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread outwards, touching and transforming everything in their path.